The first letter arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, folded perfectly, stamped with urgency, and addressed in bold red ink. At first, I thought it was junk mail, maybe a late bill or a neighborhood newsletter. But the moment I opened it, my stomach dropped. Final notice: immediate compliance required. I read the sentence 3 times before the words made sense. According to the HOA, I had violated community rules. Not once, not twice, multiple times. They claimed my property was non-compliant, my fence was unauthorized, and my driveway project had been constructed without approval. And if I didn't fix everything within 10 days, they warned fines would begin daily. That was the moment everything changed. You see, I had bought this property years before the HOA even existed. My land, my deed, my savings, my late father's dream that I worked overtime shifts to keep alive. So when this letter told me I had to ask permission for things I'd already owned for years, something didn't feel right. At first, I tried to stay calm. I emailed them politely. I asked for clarification. I assumed it was just a misunderstanding, a paperwork mix-up. That's what most people would think, right? But the replies didn't clear anything up. They got colder, shorter, more aggressive. Failure to comply will result in legal action. Soon the letters turned into warnings. The warnings turned into fines. And the fines, they started stacking up faster than I could even respond. Every week, there was another envelope waiting in my mailbox like a ticking clock I couldn't stop. Neighbors began whispering. A board member knocked on my door one evening and told me I was making things harder than they needed to be. He smiled while he said it. That smile stuck with me, because by then, I had already checked my paperwork. Every page, every signature, every boundary line, and what I found changed everything. The HOA thought I was bluffing when I told them they didn't actually have authority over my land. They laughed it off in emails. Ignore my calls. Send another violation notice the very next week. So I stopped arguing. I stopped explaining. Instead, I made one phone call. And on the morning they scheduled their final enforcement visit, a black and white patrol car slowly rolled into the neighborhood. The HOA board members were already waiting in my driveway when it happened. They expected me to back down. They expected another argument. What they didn't expect was the sheriff stepping out of that car and walking straight toward them. The moment the sheriff's door shut behind him, the air changed. You could feel it. The HOA board members had arrived early that morning like they were preparing for a performance. Clipboards in hand, printed violation photos, bright orange notices ready to tape to my front door. They stood in a small circle on my driveway, whispering to each other, glancing at my house like it already belonged to them. Then they saw the patrol car, and suddenly the confidence drained from their faces. I stood on the porch, trying to keep my hand from shaking. Not because I was scared of being wrong, but because I knew exactly what this moment meant. Months of stress, sleepless nights, endless emails, and stacks of HOA violation letters had led to this single morning. It hadn't started dramatically. It never does. When I first bought the property, it was just land and a small aging house sitting at the edge of a growing neighborhood. Quiet, peaceful, no HOA rules. No architectural committees, no monthly fees, just a simple piece of land I could slowly improve over time. For years, that's exactly what I did. I rebuilt the old fence one summer after a storm knocked half of it down. I expanded the driveway when my mom moved in so she wouldn't have to park on the street. I planted trees along the boundary line my father had once marked with wooden stakes. Everything was gradual, careful, and personal. Then the new development appeared. At first it looked harmless. A few construction trucks, some empty lots, a sign promising a beautiful planned community coming soon. The houses went up fast. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, identical paint colors. Within a year, the neighborhood had transformed into something polished and uniform. And with it came the HOA. I remember the first welcome packet they dropped off. It was thick, glossy, and filled with friendly language about community standards, property values, and shared responsibility. At the time, I barely glanced at it. I figured it was meant for the new homes, not mine. After all, my property had been here long before the development even broke ground. That assumption would come back to haunt me. The first email from the HOA arrived months later. It was polite but firm, asking me to submit architectural approval for my existing fence. I laughed when I read it. I thought it had to be a mistake. I even replied kindly, explaining that the fence had been there for years. Their response was just one sentence: all properties within the community must comply. That was the beginning of the slow shift from confusion to concern. Over the next few weeks, the tone changed. Emails turned into formal notices. Notices turned into certified letters. The HOA began referencing fines, enforcement, and something called mandatory compliance under governing documents. Every letter used the same phrase: your property is part of the HOA. But my paperwork said otherwise. Late nights became routine. I'd sit at the kitchen table surrounded by folders, closing documents, county maps, and property records. Highlighter in one hand, coffee in the other, searching for the line that proved them right, and hoping I wouldn't find it. Instead, I kept finding the opposite. No HOA covenants attached to my deed. No signed agreements. No amendments. No annexation paperwork. Nothing tying my property legally to their association. The more I read, the more uneasy I felt. Because if I was right, this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It meant they had been sending violation notices and fines to someone they didn't actually control. And yet, the letters never stopped. In fact, they escalated. One envelope arrived stamped with the words "Final Enforcement Action." Inside was a notice stating that representatives of the HOA would be visiting my property in person to document continued violations and discuss next legal steps. That visit was scheduled for today. The same morning, the sheriff stepped out of his car and began walking toward them. And judging by the way the board members suddenly stopped talking, they were starting to realize this visit wasn't going to go the way they planned. The sheriff greeted everyone politely, like this was just another routine stop. That calmness somehow made the moment feel heavier. The board members tried to recover quickly, shifting their posture, adjusting their folders, forcing polite smiles. One of them stepped forward and began speaking before the sheriff even reached the driveway. "We're glad you're here. We're dealing with a non-compliant homeowner." The word homeowner landed like a challenge. I stayed quiet, gripping the porch railing harder than I realized. My plan had always been simple: let the facts speak. But standing there, watching neighbors peek through curtains and stand at the edge of their lawns pretending to water plants, I could feel the weight of every whispered rumor that had spread over the past months. Because the HOA hadn't just been sending letters. They'd been telling a story. According to them, I was stubborn, difficult, refusing to follow community rules. The neighbor who didn't care about property values. The one who thought rules didn't apply to him. I started noticing the change slowly. Fewer waves when I drove past, shorter conversations, polite distance. It's amazing how quickly a narrative can take hold when it comes stamped with official letterhead. What most people didn't know was how close I had come to giving up. There were nights I stared at the stack of fines and wondered if it would be easier to just comply. Move the fence, redesign the driveway, submit the forms, pay the fees, blend in. It would have been cheaper, faster, quieter, and that thought scared me more than the HOA ever did. Because complying would mean admitting they were right. And deep down, I knew they weren't. But knowing something and proving it are two very different things. That's where the real crack started to form. Not with the HOA, but inside my own confidence. Every email they sent sounded so official, so certain. They quoted bylaws, regulations, enforcement procedures, words designed to overwhelm, to intimidate, to make resistance feel pointless. And it almost worked, until the night I met Mr. Alvarez. He lived 3 houses down in the newer section of the neighborhood. We had barely spoken before all this started, just the occasional nod while grabbing mail. One evening he knocked on my door, holding one of my violation letters. "They sent me this by mistake," he said. The envelope had my name on it, my address, but inside were photos of someone else's property. His property. That moment changed everything. We sat at my kitchen table for hours comparing letters, emails, timelines. The deeper we looked, the stranger things became. His HOA fines had started only months after he questioned a landscaping fee. Another neighbor had been threatened with legal action over a shed that had existed before the HOA formed. A pattern began to appear, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. They were expanding their authority. Slowly, quietly, confident that no one would push back hard enough to stop them. And that realization came with its own moral weight. Because the moment I saw the bigger picture, this stopped being just about my fence or my driveway. It became about whether I was willing to fight something bigger than myself, something that had already convinced most of the neighborhood to stay silent. Some nights, I wondered if staying quiet would make life easier for everyone. No tensión, no conflict, no patrol cars pulling into driveways. Just compliance. But then another letter would arrive. Another fine. Another warning. And each one felt less like a mistake and more like a test. How far would they go before someone pushed back? Standing on the porch now, watching the sheriff approach the group gathered in my driveway, I felt the answer hovering in the air. The board members still didn't look worried. Not yet. They still believed this was routine. A simple enforcement visit. Another homeowner about to fold. They didn't know about the research, the county records, the conversations with neighbors, the growing folder of evidence sitting on my kitchen table. And they definitely didn't know about the one document in that folder I hadn't shown anyone yet. The one I'd found buried in a stack of county filings just a week ago. A document that raised a question I couldn't stop thinking about. Not whether the HOA had authority over my land, but whether they ever had authority over part of this neighborhood at all. The sheriff stopped a few feet from the group and asked a simple question. Can someone explain what's going on here today? And for the first time since this started, the HOA board members hesitated. No one answered the sheriff right away. The silence stretched longer than it should have. Papers shuffled. Someone cleared their throat. The confident formation the HOA board had arrived with began to loosen, like a carefully stacked tower starting to lean. Finally, the board president stepped forward. We're here to document ongoing violations and move forward with enforcement, she said, voice steady, but just a little too quick. This property is refusing to comply with HOA regulations. The sheriff nodded slowly, then glanced toward me. Not questioning, just waiting. I could feel every pair of eyes in the neighborhood watching now. Curtains barely open, phones discreetly raised. The quiet morning had turned into a stage. And, suddenly, the moment felt much bigger than my driveway. I walked down the porch steps one at a time, the wooden boards creaking louder than usual beneath my feet. Every step felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. I asked the sheriff to be here, I said. My voice sounded calmer than I felt. Because this isn't an enforcement visit. It's a misunderstanding that's gone too far. The board president gave a tight smile. There's no misunderstanding. Your property falls within the HOA boundary. You've been notified repeatedly. That word again, boundary. It echoed in my head like a warning siren. The sheriff shifted his weight slightly. Do you have documentation of that? We have the governing documents, another board member said quickly, tapping the thick folder in his hands. Covenants, bylaws, enforcement authority. He said the words like they were a shield. For a moment, doubt crept in again. That old familiar voice whispering, what if they're right? What if you miss something? Then I remembered the late nights. The county office. The maps spread across the kitchen table. The document. My heart began to pound harder. Because this was the moment everything would turn. I have documentation too, I said. The reaction was immediate. Subtle but there. Shoulders stiffened. Eyes narrowed. That confident smile flickered for half a second before returning. The board president let out a short laugh. We've reviewed your emails. If you had proof, you would have sent it already. She wasn't wrong. I hadn't sent it. I kept it quiet, waiting, double-checking, reading every line until the words blurred. Because once this came out, there would be no going back to quiet emails and polite notices. This would become a confrontation. And confrontation has consequences. The sheriff looked between us. All right, let's slow this down. What exactly is the dispute? Short sentences now. Short breaths. The world narrowing to the space between us. They claim authority over my property, I said. And they say they have it, he replied. Yes. And you're saying they don't. I'm saying they never did. The wind picked up just enough to rustle the stack of violation notices in the board members' hands. A few pages slipped loose and scattered across the driveway like fallen leaves. No one moved to pick them up. The tension was starting to feel physical. One of the board members stepped forward, frustration breaking through the polished tone. "We've spent months trying to resolve this. We've sent notices, fines, opportunities to comply. This homeowner has refused every step." The word refused hung in the air like an accusation. I swallowed hard, because part of me knew how this looked. To them, to the neighbors, to anyone who hadn't lived through the slow drip of letters and threats. Stubborn homeowner versus organized community. Simple story. Except simple stories are rarely true. The sheriff turned to me again. "What made you call me today?" That question hit harder than anything else. Because the real answer wasn't simple. It wasn't just about my fence, or the fines, or the letters. It was about the document sitting in the folder I held under my arm. The one I had reread at least 20 times. The one that didn't just challenge their authority, it threatened the foundation of everything they believed about this neighborhood. I exhaled slowly, because today, I said, they scheduled what they called a final enforcement visit. The sheriff nodded once, and they planned to place legal notices on my property. The board president cut in quickly. "Standard procedure. On property," I continued, "they may not legally control." Silence again, heavier this time. The sheriff's expression didn't change, but the energy shifted. Slightly, subtly, enough to feel. "Do you have something that supports that claim?" he asked. My fingers tightened around the folder. Inside, it was the paper that had kept me awake for an entire week. "This," I said, keeping my voice steady, "is the recorded boundary amendment for the original development phase." No one spoke. The sheriff scanned the page, eyes moving line by line. His expression stayed neutral, but his pace slowed the further he read. That alone made my heart start pounding faster. One of the board members tried to recover first. "We've already reviewed all governing documents." "That doesn't change. It's not one of your governing documents," I said quietly. That stopped him. "It's a county filing, filed 2 years before the HOA was even formed." The silence came back, thicker now, less comfortable. The sheriff looked up. "Explain what this means." I swallowed, because saying it out loud still felt unreal. "It shows the development was divided into phases. Phase 1 and Phase 2. I pointed to the map attached to the filing. The HOA authority was only ever attached to Phase 2. A long pause. The board president shook her head immediately. "Too quickly. That's not accurate. All properties within the community are marketed as part of the community," I said. "But marketing isn't the same as legal annexation." The word sounded sharper than I intended. Months of frustration finally breaking through. The sheriff's gaze returned to the document. "So you're saying your property isn't in Phase 2. I'm saying my property sits inside Phase 1. And Phase 1 was never annexed into the HOA." You could feel the shift ripple through the group. A subtle collapse of certainty, like a floor tilting just enough to make everyone lose their footing. One of the board members laughed nervously. "That's impossible. The developer told us," and then he stopped talking. The sentence hung unfinished in the air. The sheriff caught it immediately. "The developer told you what?" The board members exchanged glances. Quick, silent. A conversation happening without words. And suddenly, I understood something I hadn't considered before. They might not have known. Not at the beginning. The realization hit like a cold wave. All those months of letters. Fees, warnings. The growing pressure. The confidence in their tone. The insistence that I must comply. What if they genuinely believed they had authority? What if someone had told them they did? The sheriff tapped the document lightly. "Who handled the original HOA formation?" The board president hesitated, just long enough to notice. "The developer," she said finally. And there it was. The first crack in the story they'd been telling for months. Because I had a second document in the folder, one I hadn't even planned to show today. But the moment had shifted. The energy had changed. And instinct told me this was the point of no return. I pulled out the second paper. "This is the developer's filing for HOA jurisdiction." The sheriff reached for it. The board members leaned closer again, tension visibly tightening across their faces. This filing references annexation of future phases, I continued. But there's no record of Phase 1 ever being annexed afterward. No vote, no amendment, no homeowner consent. The sheriff read silently. Seconds passed. Long seconds. Finally, he looked up. So the HOA may have been operating under the assumption this phase was included without legal confirmation. The words landed like thunder. The board president's face lost color. That can't be right. But doubt had already entered the room. And doubt spreads fast. I felt no triumph. No satisfaction. Just a strange heaviness settling in my chest. Because this twist changed everything. If the HOA had knowingly pushed authority they didn't have, this was one kind of story. But if they'd been misled from the start, then the problem was bigger than any of us standing in this driveway. It meant someone else had set this in motion years ago. Someone who wasn't here today. Someone who had built an entire system on an assumption that might never have been true. The sheriff closed the folder slowly. I think this situation is more complicated than an enforcement visit. The words felt like the ground shifting again beneath our feet. The board members stood frozen, caught between disbelief and realization. And for the first time since this began, I saw something in their expressions I hadn't seen before. Not authority, not confidence, fear. The driveway had never felt so small. Everyone stood closer now. The neat lines that had separated us and them all morning were gone. The sheriff held both documents in his hands, flipping between them slowly, carefully, like each page carried more weight than the last. This isn't something that gets settled on a driveway, he finally said. But what I can say is that placing legal notices or attempting enforcement on property without confirmed jurisdiction could create serious legal problems. The words were calm, professional, but the impact was immediate. The board president lowered her clipboard. One of the other members quietly gathered the scattered violation notices from the ground. No one argued. No one interrupted. The confidence that had filled the driveway an hour earlier had completely dissolved. For the first time, the tension shifted away from me. I didn't feel victorious. I felt exhausted. Months of pressure draining out all at once, leaving behind a strange, quiet emptiness. So what happens now? One board member asked the sheriff, his voice noticeably softer. You pause, the sheriff said simply. You verify jurisdiction. You speak to legal counsel. And you stop enforcement until you know where your authority actually begins. A long silence followed. Then the board president nodded. Understood. Just like that, the confrontation ended without raised voices or dramatic arguments. The folders closed. The clipboards lowered. The group that had arrived prepared to enforce compliance now stood uncertain, recalculating everything they thought they knew. One by one, they began walking back toward their cars. Neighbors slowly disappeared from sidewalks and windows. Curtains closed. Sprinklers shut off. The quiet morning returned as if nothing had happened, except everything had. The sheriff handed my documents back to me before heading toward his patrol car. You did the right thing calling before this escalated, he said. Paperwork matters. I nodded, unable to find the right words. The patrol car pulled away, and for the first time in months, the driveway was empty again. I stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle, letting the adrenaline fade, letting the reality sink in that the constant stream of letters and fines had finally stopped, or at least paused, because deep down, I knew this wasn't truly the end. Not yet. That feeling proved right 2 weeks later. A certified letter arrived, not from the HOA, from a law firm. My heart dropped the moment I saw the return address. For a split second, I thought the fight was starting all over again, that this was the legal battle everyone had warned me about. But when I opened the envelope, the first line stopped me cold. We represent the Homeowners Association regarding an urgent matter. I kept reading. The letter explained that after reviewing county filings, the HOA's attorney had confirmed what the document suggested. Phase 1 had never been legally annexed into the association. Enforcement actions against my property were being withdrawn immediately. All fines removed. All violations voided. Relief washed over me so fast it almost felt dizzying. But the letter wasn't finished. The next paragraph changed everything again, because the attorney explained that the HOA board had discovered something during their review, something buried deep in the developer's original filings. A clause, one that had been overlooked for years. A clause stating that Phase 1 properties could only be annexed into the HOA through a majority vote of Phase 1 homeowners. A vote that had never happened. I read the sentence 3 times before the implication fully hit me. For years, everyone in Phase 1 had quietly assumed they were already part of the HOA. They had paid fees, followed rules, submitted approvals, without ever being legally required to do so. The developer had written the possibility of annexation into the documents, but never completed the final step. The HOA hadn't been expanding its authority. It had inherited a misunderstanding, one that had lasted for years. The final page of the letter explained that the HOA would be notifying all Phase 1 homeowners and offering refunds for past dues while they decided whether to hold an official annexation vote. I set the letter down slowly on the kitchen table. The fight I thought was about my fence had turned into something far bigger. This wasn't just about proving my property stood outside the HOA. It was about revealing that an entire section of the neighborhood had been living under rules they were never legally bound to follow. And suddenly, the biggest decision wasn't whether the HOA had authority over me. It was whether my neighbors would choose to give it to them. The weeks after the letter felt strangely quiet. For the first time in months, the mailbox stopped feeling like a source of anxiety. No bawelasche notices, no warnings, no certified envelopes stamped with urgency. Just ordinary mail again. Grocery flyers, utility bills, the kind of normal that used to feel boring and now felt priceless. But the silence didn't last long. The HOA sent out a community-wide announcement a few days later. Every home in Phase 1 received the same packet I had stared at for months, except this time, the tone was completely different. No threats, no deadlines, no enforcement language, just an explanation. They admitted the oversight, explained the missing annexation vote, offered refunds for past HOA fees, and most importantly, they announced a community meeting to decide what would happen next. For the first time, the choice belonged to the homeowners. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse parking lot overflowed. Cars lined both sides of the street. People who had barely spoken to each other for years suddenly stood in small circles, talking in low voices, comparing letters, asking questions, sharing stories that sounded eerily similar. Mr. Alvarez waved when I walked in. That small gesture meant more than he probably realized. Inside, the atmosphere felt completely different from the driveway confrontation weeks earlier. The board members didn't sit behind a long table this time. They sat among the crowd. Not as enforcers, as neighbors. The board president stood up first. Her voice wasn't polished or rehearsed anymore. It sounded honest, tired, human. She apologized, not in legal language, not in careful corporate phrases. Just a simple apology for the stress, the letters, and the confusion that had built up over the years. She explained how the misunderstanding had followed them from the developer's original paperwork, passed from board to board without anyone realizing the final annexation step had never been completed. Then she said something that surprised me. If you vote to join the HOA, we'll welcome you. If you vote not to, we'll respect that. This decision should have always been yours. The room stayed quiet for a long time after that. One by one, people stood up to speak. Some talked about the benefits of shared rules and maintained property values. Others talked about independence and the importance of property rights. There wasn't anger in the room anymore, just honest disagreement and a shared realization that everyone had been living inside the same misunderstanding. When the meeting ended, the vote was scheduled for the following month. And for the first time since the very first letter arrived, the future didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a choice. A week later, I found myself repairing a loose board on the same fence that had started this entire story. The late afternoon sun stretched long shadows across the yard. The neighborhood felt calm again. Mr. Alvarez walked over and leaned against the fence post. "Funny how all this started over a few pieces of wood," he said. I laughed. It was never really about the fence. He nodded. No, it was about knowing where the lines actually are. That sentence stayed with me long after he walked back home. Because the biggest lesson from this entire experience wasn't about HOAs, paperwork, or legal documents. It was about assumptions, how easily they grow, how quietly they spread, and how powerful it can be to simply ask one question: is this actually true? The vote results arrived by mail a month later. Phase 1 homeowners chose not to join the HOA. No drama, no celebración, just a quiet decision made by people who finally had the full picture. Life in the neighborhood didn't change overnight. Lawns still got mowed. Neighbors still waved. Kids still rode bikes down the street in the evenings. The difference was subtle but meaningful. The pressure was gone, and in its place was something better: clarity. Sometimes the biggest battles don't end with courtroom victories or dramatic speeches. Sometimes they end with a letter, a conversation, and the quiet realization that the truth was there all along, waiting for someone to look closely enough to find it. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's this: never assume authority just because it arrives on official letterhead. Never ignore the voice that tells you to double-check. And never underestimate the power of standing up calmly, respectfully, and with the facts on your side. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs the reminder that asking questions isn't rebellion, it's responsibility.